really look forward to it being just more of a discussion. So thank you so much to Shobha and to Cecilia and to ILA for all of you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. So I'm going to be talking about mapping linguistic diversity and documenting endangered languages in New York, this linguistic capital that we all, I think, live in or around, many of us anyway. And as Shobha mentioned, not to sort of promote too much or too soon, but I have a book coming out which will sort of be a deeper version in the sense of this talk. It's not a book talk, but it's called Language City, The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York, which is coming out in February, timed with International Mother Language Day, February 21st. And it's a book for a general audience that I hope will be, will draw people to the study of language, to linguistic diversity, language documentation, but also sort of have some interesting surprises for those like yourselves who are already doing this work. So it's both a kind of linguistic history of the city, and I haven't really seen linguistic histories of cities, at least for a sort of general audience that sort of try to sort of take on the many strands of especially the sort of indigenous, endangered, and minoritized languages spoken in a city. And it also sort of has 6 portraits of speakers that we've worked with most closely over the years. Some of the speakers we've worked with most closely at the Endangered Language Alliance who hail from different parts of the globe and are doing various sorts of things to document, maintain, and revitalize their languages in sort of greater New York, I should say. It's not just the 5 boroughs of New York City, although of course that's sort of at the center in some ways, but it also encompasses the whole kind of metropolitan area, as has our work. So with that said, maybe just a brief introduction to the place where I work, the Endangered Language Alliance, for those who may not be aware. I think some may be aware. I see Charles Haverhill is in the room, who's one of our members of our board, and Mariam Borjan, who we've worked with as well. So it's really nice to see familiar faces or names. So we're a nonprofit here in New York, an independent nonprofit that was founded in 2010, sort of starting from the insight that that there was a role that linguists could play working with language activists and community members in a city like New York, outside or a step away from an academic context, sort of hanging up a shingle, as it were, right in the middle of the city. We have an office space near Union Square, which is a place where the sort of world of academic linguists can sort of interface with the world of community language teachers, of language activists, and of speakers to work on a range of projects that are of mutual interest. That it can be a sort of all-purpose space where, a platform where any number of projects can happen, sort of encompassing the range from language documentation of a more kind of formal academic nature to language revitalization projects and classes and other things that I'll briefly touch on. But part of the realization behind this and why it sort of came together in 2010, at a time when I actually was still doing my PhD fieldwork in Southwest China on a language called Trung, a Tibeto-Burman language, in a sort of traditional language documentation mode, I guess you could say, of extended fieldwork in a place, far from home. I'm originally from New York. The reason why it was founded at that time was a sort of realization that, of course, cities are linguistically diverse, and they're places of language mixing and of translanguaging and of linguistic diversity. But in recent decades, it has become sort of that the pace of that has accelerated to an extraordinary degree, and there are now increasingly there are endangered languages, little documented languages that are spoken, kind of right next door, essentially, to where linguists are often, based, living, teaching, and they're right in the middle of our cities. The pace of urbanization, of sort of global migration, has led to people moving now from some of the major sort of linguistic hotspots around the world, which I'll touch on, to cities like New York. Not only New York, but New York is sort of an extraordinary and extreme case because it's so much shaped by migration historically. But we believe that this is actually now sort of happening in all or most cities. and that, yes, we think of the sort of major national languages that are spoken, and people think of the diversity of, oh, there's so many speakers of Spanish or so many speakers of Mandarin and so on, but actually that the depth of linguistic diversity goes much deeper than most people think, and that it's a crucial lens on urban life, the future of cities, and that there's a real sort of opportunity for linguists to face the public, and work with communities in a different way, perhaps, than the kind of fieldwork that I had been doing, in Southwest China, which was, sort of going someplace thousands of miles away while there was the opportunity, but then inevitably sort of returning. The work in a city at a place like ELA kind of enables long-term open-ended collaborations, I think, in a different way. So just kind of briefly to do sort of an overview of some of the kinds of activities. Part of it is about public events and sort of bringing languages onto the stage, the public stage that they haven't necessarily had before. So we do frequent events. These are just some posters from a series called Unheard Of, which was a 10-part series, ongoing in some ways, that introduces threatened languages and literatures from around the world and sort of gives languages a platform, speakers, musicians, dancers, storytellers. We've also had a tradition of hosting classes in languages that are not taught often even at universities, or have seldom been taught, and that community language teachers and communities themselves want to sort of want to be learning in a community space that's convenient. So Quechua, Quiche, Hawaiian, Tibetan, Breton, Lenape as well, which I'll touch on. Publishing and children's books in particular, we've just finished a series of 6 children's books in the Pamiri languages of Tajikistan, helmed by Wakhi speaker and language activist Husnia Hujamyorova, this has been her sort of passion. She's one of the kind of language activists here in New York we've been working with for many years, wanted to do a series of children's books. Here's one of the earlier ones that we did in the Tso language, the Austronesian language of Taiwan. And this is an example on the bottom of the so-called Mixtec Mothers Group, a group of women actually who are even meeting today in the office as I speak from here, around literacy in the traditionally oral Mixtecan indigenous languages, Otomanguean languages of southern and central Mexico. So sort of a group of women and their children sort of learning to read and write in their language, and actually working towards a children's book as well. So yes, this question, I see the question from Alexandra. The programs of learning different languages, the classes and so on, our events are, generally free. We enable, there are sometimes language teachers who bring, who want to teach a class here, and they want to, they need to cover some of their own costs. And so it's up to them if they want to charge usually a very modest fee for students sometimes, just to cover their costs. But ELA, we don't sort of take any profit from it. And generally the events that we're sort of running are free. So occasionally, teachers will charge a small amount. Thanks for that question. And that'll just be to sort of to cover their costs and their work. So also increasing kind of component of our work is around, I guess you could say, language advocacy and language access, and helping working with communities who are facing major language barriers in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of courts and hospitals where people need translation and interpretation. We frequently get contacted by courts and hospitals, and by all kinds of different government agencies and other nonprofits who are looking for translators and interpreters. And like other linguists working in different situations, we've realized that often you can't, if you're doing community collaboration, you can't just sort of work on language in isolation, but that it's connected to health and interpretation, language access, and all kinds of other different things. And this has become increasingly pressing in the last couple of years with COVID, where and other health challenges, challenges around immigration, where we have been sort of working with different, especially city agencies, especially the Department of Health, around translating messages and reaching indigenous Latin American communities, speaking a variety of languages from Mexico, Guatemala, and Ecuador, especially. Yeah, this work has had, sort of explored the connections between language and health. It's been responding, obviously, to really, urgent needs. One result of it, we hope, is the sort of building up of an indigenous interpreters network. These are, languages for which interpretation is often sort of scarce in terms of professional interpreters and resources, and the sort of the usual companies, often private for-profit companies, are not really able to provide the right kind of language access, interpretation, and translation in these languages. Are there any important ethical considerations you think of when discussing the use of translators and interpreters? Yeah, thank you for that question. There are many. I think the basic, even the model of how interpretation and translation are done, there's a major ethical dimension where, I mean, now various agencies and companies and so on are, they're trying to meet some of this need, but they're often doing it through these large private companies, which sort of outsource the work to the cheapest places around the world they can find translators in, and then the companies keep most of the profit for themselves. And then in terms of the quality control, the connection to the community, it's questionable, I think, in many cases. They're as big companies, there are certain things they can do. They can certainly fill out the RFPs. They certainly have the sort of capacity to handle a lot of the bureaucracy or project management. But our involvement, again, is not in any way kind of as a business entity. There's no kind of profit in it. It's basically we've been supporting the creation of essentially a co-op that is now being supported from a few other different organizations as well. A co-op that will consists of interpreters in a range over a dozen different indigenous languages. And actually similar things are now happening for several African and Asian languages, again, where there's a real need, especially in the city. The interpreters are based here in the city. They're members of these communities. They it's even sort of more than just being a translator or interpreter. It's being a sort of ambassador and fellow community member. Yeah, there's a range of other issues I think we could get into that come up as well, just in the process of translating and interpreting, where I'm not the expert. They are those who are doing it. But this is certainly one part of what we do, is trying to sort of support the growth of better sort of community grounded translation and interpretation services. So even karaoke represents a kind of one of the sorts of things that we've done, supporting in this case Garifuna singer and activist James Lavelle in his revitalization work with the community. This is a major Afro-Indigenous language, right, of Central America, that now has huge presence in the Bronx and Brooklyn. So he's been using karaoke and karaoke videos to revitalize and kind of maintain the language here. So kind of panning out, that's a little bit about what ELA, the range of projects that we do, in addition to language documentation, which now I'll talk about a little bit more, and sort of more traditional academic work, and a whole range of other projects, working with artists who have projects that are supporting linguistic diversity, raising awareness in various ways. But I want to step back and maybe talk a little bit about, New York, and what language endangerment and documentation look like here in the city. So I think the traditional, to the extent that there has been, an organized body of linguists really thinking and talking about language endangerment since especially the 1990s, when it sort of famously kind of appeared on the LSA radar, at least, with Ken Hale and others, has been thinking about these parts of the world, sort of hotspots, as some would call them, where there's an urgent need for language documentation, right? And this was part of how I became involved working in the Himalaya, which is one such area. But there has been a lot less attention to how migration is really transforming this picture and how cities are now a piece of the puzzle. So this is just sort of zooming in a little bit on some of these so-called hotspots. And these are places that people are now leaving en masse in many cases and coming to regional cities, certainly near them, cities like Mexico City or Johannesburg or Port Moresby, in country, but also increasingly there's international migration, and people are coming to places like New York. So the arrows just indicate certain areas in the Himalaya, in West Africa, in sort of South and Central Mexico, which are now major sending regions to New York just in the last few decades, bringing hundreds of languages which were really not here to any large extent, if at all, 30, 40 years ago. And that has presented, in particular, this huge opportunity. And while we've worked with languages from sort of all over in a very opportunistic way, based on often speakers and language activists kind of approaching us from different communities, we have also tended, I think, to focus, on what we can do here in New York, which is where we're based, and then working with speakers who come from these areas where, we know there are a lot of people in New York, and there is a large number of little documented and highly endangered languages. So this is probably familiar to some of you, at least. This just one kind of way of talking about language endangerment and sort of ranking it that has been used, called EGIDS. This is not necessarily the end all be all, but it's obviously kind of one model of thinking about how endangerment happens. But again, how does this work in cities? Cities are traditionally thought of as places where endangerment is, if anything, accelerated. The pressures to shift language are become extreme in some cases. And of course, migration can be a sort of multi-step process. It's not necessarily directly from a town in Oaxaca or Puebla directly to Brooklyn or Queens. It may pass through other cities and other places where language shift is also happening. Another part of this is that language shift in a place like New York is not necessarily directly to English. There are speakers of indigenous Mexican languages who may not speak much Spanish in the area that they came from, and actually are learning or using more Spanish when they come here. Likewise, you'll have Central Asian communities who were shifting, already perhaps shifting to Russian in country, and that shift continues when they move to an area like Brighton Beach, where Russian is a lingua franca, or Himalayan communities that, where there may have already been some shift going on to Nepali or Tibetan in country, but that accelerates when coming to Jackson Heights. So assimilation and language shift are happening on sort of multiple dimensions. In terms of the history of the New York area and its linguistic diversity, I mean, language endangerment sort of even affects and is tied to the original language of the land, Lenape. Pardon this term, Lenni Lenape is an outdated term, but this is still sort of one of the better maps that shows at least gives some picture of some of the groups whose names are attested, and what some of the sort of splits might have looked like before colonization. Lenape, we've hosted classes in Lenape by a language revitalizer coming down from Canada, which is where one of the Lenape reserves is today, as people were dispersed and displaced over centuries, leaving not much of a visible Lenape community in the New York area. But this was the first time with Karen Moscow's classes that, and this is in our center, that Lenape had actually been brought back to the city and taught here in several centuries. There is, as far as is kind of known, one native speaker of Lenape itself left in Canada of the Munsee variety, although there are people like Karen who are Lenape and who are to different degrees heritage speakers and are trying to revive the language. And then, you have with Dutch colonization exactly 400 years ago, really this coming year, 1624, not just a sort of Dutch colony, and certainly something very distinctive from the surrounding sort of English-only colonies which were being established, but more of a commercial entrepot where even in the early years when there were just several hundred settlers here, a reported 18 languages, and that may well not have been really accounting for, this is sort of my count of what was probably spoken there, looking into the sort of documentation that there is, probably more than 18 actually, if all sort of languages brought by enslaved Africans and by native peoples are accounted for. And there's a lot of indeterminacy here with this as well, but it's notable that many of these would now be considered endangered to different degrees, and that it represented, already the city at that point represented a sort of fulcrum and meeting place of languages of three continents. Obviously then, moving sort of fast forwarding to today, we could do a whole linguistic kind of history of the city. That's part of what I do in Language City. But basically you have 4 centuries of constant immigration, such that today, approximately almost 40%, between 35 and 40% of the city's population, and it's, true in many outlying, suburban areas as well, in the metro area, were born in another country. Half of all New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home. Of course, for many, that's Spanish or that's Mandarin or Russian. But the depth of linguistic diversity is much more profound than most people realize. And again, these are some of the regions where indigenous languages of Latin America that are coming to New York, areas like La Mixteca in South Central Mexico, and the sort of South Central highlands of Ecuador, where various forms of Quechuan are spoken. Nepal, this is an area I'll kind of focus in on a little bit, since it's one area where I've worked to a degree. The sort of Himalayan part of Nepal, especially, I mean, almost all of these languages are now represented in New York. And this is just sort of focusing in on, if you see where the arrow is pointing to this area called Mustang, right on the border with Tibet, one sort of valley, former kingdom with just over 10,000 people, zooming in, half a dozen languages spoken there to different degrees. Again, all represented with a substantial, pretty substantial communities relative to their size in New York. And it's been estimated that, at least a quarter of all people from Mustang, including, speakers of all of these, are now in New York. And so an example of kind of the language documentation work that we do would be a language called Seke, which is one of those languages of Mustang, probably the smallest and most endangered. And it was really sort of only after working with speakers of other Mustangi languages that we started to meet speakers of Seke who are here, living primarily in a couple of buildings in Brooklyn. And of the sort of estimated 700 speakers, probably over 200 are here in New York, speaking to different degrees. I'm still trying to sort of work out what the sort of dialectology of Seke is, but there are at least 3 distinctive varieties across these different villages, and a high degree of multilingualism and obviously language shift and contact that are happening. So what we began to do is, work both here with especially sort of young speakers who were, enthusiastic, some of the youngest speakers anywhere, who were enthusiastic about doing something for the language, and starting with a field methods class, actually, that I was teaching at Columbia, and then sort of bringing that work back, as we often do, to the LA. And then finding an opportunity to go to Nepal as well, and to go talk to the especially elderly people, mostly, who are still in the village, who haven't migrated, since it's typically kind of younger and working age people who completely leave for a variety of reasons, common to so many migration situations: economic opportunity, climate change, education, political factors as well. We could talk all about that. But so part of the model here is not just doing the field work in New York, in the city, where there are certainly limitations, right? I mean, in terms of the natural environment, in terms of the cultural elements that are going to be hard to preserve. People do try in various ways to keep them up in an apartment building in Brooklyn, but there are obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages to diaspora fieldwork, and this is part of what we sort of have been talking about at ELA. But the idea is to do this kind of transnational or translocal work, saying translocal because that's emphasizing that we're talking about very specific localities, right? A building or a neighborhood in Brooklyn and a village called Tuksang in Nepal, not necessarily, Nepal and the United States writ large. We could probably, talk, in a lot more depth about this, but just to give a sense of Seke multilingualism and the contact situations, there's both the sort of surrounding Tibetic language Loke and its variety Baragon that surround Seke and that are themselves, at this point, having a lot of transmission issues, as well as Nepali as a national language, Tibetan as a language in religious settings, and of course now increasingly English. So, in terms of the goals of the language documentation work, it's not necessarily that different from some of the sort of traditional, I guess now we could say traditional ideas and definitions that you see from Nicholas Himmelman or Tony Woodbury, Jeff Good, these concepts of, creating, annotating, preserving, and disseminating, clear records of a language, archiving those materials, trying to get a range of materials that can sort of represent linguistic practices of a community. But drawing on all of the different thinking that has been going on in the field of language documentation, which is what I was sort of trained in, and doing a lot of recording, which I can point all of you to where that lives. Both our sort of archive that we have, the ELA archive, which is part of is a repository within the Internet Archive, as well as YouTube and things that are very public facing. These collaboration models as well, thinking about the sort of traditional Boasian trilogy, doing lexicographic work and obviously grammatical analysis. So all of these things are still very much part of what we're doing in terms of language documentation, but we're thinking about it in a sort of translocal diasporic frame of that it has to be multi-sited and it has to account for these patterns of urbanization and migration that are happening. So perhaps familiar to some of you, Elon transcription and Flex projects, and we have a number of these going. And I should say, in general with the work at ELA, there are some languages like Seke, some situations that are sort of multi-year, very open-ended long-term projects where we're trying to do sort of documentation in that way. And then there are other situations where somebody stops by who wants to record a song, or somebody calls us to do one interview with their grandmother who speaks Italo Romance variety from Puglia in Queens. And we do that, and even if it's not a deep engagement with the language, it's that we're sort of here to respond to those calls. So with the remaining time before I look forward to the more of a discussion, I want to talk about the sort of mapping work, which has also grown out of this in more recent years, and is in a way sort of ties a lot of it together. We realized pretty quickly that most of the languages that we were working on, the people who were approaching us, the people we were finding, who come from these areas like La Mixteca in Mexico, or the Himalayan region of Nepal, West Africa, that most of these languages were not appearing in any official data about the languages spoken in New York. If you look at census data, it was showing sort of in a typical year, it would show just around 100 languages spoken in New York. And the most kind of exhaustive dive that was done about a decade ago, looking at the whole metropolitan area, still found fewer than 200. And I don't know if any of you have kind of used or tried to use census data around language, but it just has a variety of problems, which we could talk about in depth, both the way the question is asked, who is likely to respond to it. There's a lot of fear and questions around the census, the way it's tabulated, which has, I think been improved in recent years, but still you'll see sort of groupings of languages that are based on groupings that linguists themselves have left behind long ago. Some of it has to do with privacy concerns. Some of it has to do with, what sort of speakers themselves, even if they do fill in the census, how likely they are, for various reasons of vestigial shame or wondering, not knowing if the world would even care what their mother tongue really is. Multilingualism is completely not sort of covered by the census. They basically throw out any data beyond the first language that you fill in. So there's a variety of reasons why the census data is really not robust at all beyond the sort of largest languages. And so this prompted us to try to draw on this immense network of speakers and language activists and teachers and others in the New York area to do what we think is sort of the first linguist-led census, I guess, linguist and speaker-led census of a city's languages. And with that, we found, over 700 language varieties and counting from all over the world, which this is the sort of initial print map that we made, which color codes by different regions of the world, does use size to sort of show, the relative size of communities, but still the general point of the map is to bring out and to give space to minoritized, indigenous, and endangered languages. So we could, of course, layer English or Spanish or, African American English or, even Bengali or Korean. We could layer them over this and they would sort of take over the whole thing. But here, we've limited the number of times that any given language can be shown in order, to bring out much more clearly the languages which are not even, which we know to be spoken by thousands, if not tens of thousands of New Yorkers, but don't appear in any form on the census data. And so just zooming in a little bit on some of the, particular kind of hotspots within the city, you could say, to map the city's languages is not just to sort of, see it visualized. It's to actually sort of discover things and to find, to have sort of heuristics about settlement patterns and about the linguistic geography of the city and how, how settlement happens. So, just starting with what you might call post-Soviet Brooklyn, Brighton Beach and Bensonhurst and the surrounding Sheepshead Bay, those areas, which are thought of by many New Yorkers as, quote unquote, a Russian neighborhood. There are a number of things to say. This is both a kind of microcosm of a whole region of the world, the former Soviet Union, that has now been sort of concentrated in just a couple of neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Russian serves as a lingua franca, certainly. And in terms of the historical settlement patterns, this was it probably began in the 1960s and 70s. There was a sort of an Ashkenazi Jewish presence, which was vestigially Yiddish speaking, English speaking, a little bit of Russian. That drew Russian speaking Jews, that in turn drew other Russian speakers, and that since the 1990s especially has drawn this whole world of people from the former Soviet Union for whom Russian is a lingua franca, but actually there is a huge variety of mother tongues, which has led in turn to the largest Uzbek speaking community in the Western Hemisphere, and now even sort of substantial new communities of speakers of a language like Sakha, the Turkic language of Yakutia in Siberia, and many others. So there are kind of there is sort of succession patterns here of one group drawing another, certain groups that co-territorially kind of settle with others for often linguistic and other purposes. And we see this too in what's happening in the indigenous South Bronx and West African Harlem and the Bronx, where French and Arabic may serve as lingua francas, but there are over 100 mother tongues that we've identified there through talking to speakers. And of course, there's sort of much more going on. It's not only those from francophone parts of West Africa. But again, there is a sort of succession pattern of certain groups coming after certain others, certain ones, certain settling near others. And of course, there's a range of factors from real estate prices to transit to, job opportunities, occupational niches. There's a whole kind of world of complexity that I try to unpack in Language City, my book. But, the map at least kind of opens the door and allows us to start thinking about some of the patterning that really is behind this. And there's a lot more we could say about why are these sort of labels where they are, how did we do the mapping process. We've written an article in Language Documentation and Conservation, the journal out of Hawaii, that goes into a lot of detail about this. These are keyed to significant sites, and for privacy reasons, we're not always kind of naming them or putting them exactly kind of on the exact location. But generally, we're talking about religious institutions, community centers, hometown associations, that whole kind of world of those organizations, which really is the sort of bedrock of the immigrant city. And as we'll hopefully get a chance to see quickly, the digital version of this map, which we subsequently worked on, kind of provides some more detail on this. This is sort of looking at Himalayan or South Asian Jackson Heights. So the digital version, I want to maybe quickly try to show you guys, if you haven't seen it before, do a very quick sort of demo before we open things up. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to try to share that. Okay, hopefully you can see now languagemap.nyc. This is the digital version of the language map, which was launched just a couple of years ago. All of this has been, many years in the making, but and we continue to update this as much as we can. And as I said, there's over 700 language varieties from around the metropolitan area that are here at around over 1,200 significant sites. So languages, may appear multiple times, although, as I said, the largest languages are sort of not allowed to dominate. So maybe just briefly showing, here we have a sort of search function where if we were to look for Mixteco, for instance, which, is perhaps the most widely spoken indigenous Mexican language, perhaps indigenous Latin American language in the city, you'll see a number of different neighborhoods where there's a concentration and a significant site. You'll also see even in New Brunswick, a particular community of a particular variety. And we could click on any one of these, and then we'll sort of zoom in to that point where there will be a sort of community profile, which will talk about the community more generally, as well as a little more information about that particular site or point, including, a restaurant, a family, a community. In some cases, these points will, and there is a way to sort of filter by sort of size as best we can. Of course, this is the ELA data. It doesn't have census-like sort of coverage or precision. But in some cases, we're talking about very, very small communities. In some cases, we're talking about large ones. But here we have sort of ways to sort, to see other, all the languages of Mexico that are spoken in the city kind of in one place. And then you can sort of, click from there and go further. You can sort of go navigate to other categories and look by language, world region, language family. Some of this is sort of drawing on other schemas, certainly, that that already that already exist. Like we try to be careful with the debates around different language families and so on. So this Explore tab is sort of a way to just explore these different categories and drill in. And then you can also just as well click on the map and navigate as you would with any map. And there's zooming in, zooming out, 3D functions, some layers to look at sort of neighborhoods or counties as kind of units. So then you'll click and see sort of everything that's in central Harlem. If you click on any given language, again, there are videos. Usually we have ELA videos here that will pop up. This might take a minute, this one, but you can view them sort of right in the inside the map, and there are share functions and so on. The data tab is sort of the best place to really see it all in one place in tabular form, and this is downloadable here. So, it's, again, I think that the strength of the ELA data is a lot of it is very qualitative and it's in the stories, those descriptions, but we've tried to sort of pool, data on the languages globally, as well as sort of what we know locally. And so this is a place to sort of filter things that if you wanted to look for, all the languages of Nepal that are spoken in the city, you could filter here, and then this will affect the map. So this will change what dots appear on the map by doing things here in the data tab. So you would do, view results in map. I'm going to turn off the neighborhoods. And then this gives you a kind of quick snapshot. Okay, where are the languages of Nepal, that are spoken in New York? And of course, there's a dense concentration kind of in and around Jackson Heights, and you can sort of go in and explore further. Yeah, I can turn that off. But lastly, maybe I'll show quickly that we also do incorporate census data here to the best of our ability, since there aren't it's often not easy to access or certainly to map the latest census data on language, despite all of its issues. It's good for the largest languages. So here we've just provided an interface to do that by Census Tract or Puma, for those of you who are familiar with how census data works. And it shows, instead of the dots, it shows these polygons, right, based on the unit that you're looking at. So here for Yiddish, you can see in this area of Brooklyn, this is the number, and that can be sort of, you can compare and go back and forth between sort of the dot-based data, which is the ELA data, and the polygon data for these larger languages, which comes from the census. And they make for sort of interesting comparisons, I think, on many levels. For instance, the census has up till now only really collected almost all the data on African languages is sort of put under this category Niger-Congo. And this is now sort of a major, there's a lot of speakers of the so-called Niger-Congo languages. I say so-called because the census groups them and tabulates them in a strange way. But if you really wanted to see what are they talking about, we could try to sort of break this down with the ELA data, even just sort of filtering by Africa, and we could see that actually, what they're calling sort of lumping together as Niger-Congo languages, actually, we can get a lot more granularity on what languages they're talking about. So it's, as I say, there's, so much, we're trying to sort of really make visible and expand the data that exists about language in New York City. Yeah, I think maybe this would be a good time to pause. And maybe let me try to quickly answer the last couple of questions here, if that would be the best thing. How did you survey the communities to determine the language name and dialect term? Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we sort of grew out of the ELA network and discussions also with various experts. There are always going to be sort of differences and questions. We were not trying to reinvent the wheel. So if there were already certain sources that we drew on, whether it's Glottolog or Ethnologue, but yeah, we tried to we had thousands of conversations, and not in a highly formalized way, I should say. I mean, there was a survey with a set of questions, but a lot of it was sort of a more open-ended discussions and relationships with communities. And yes, it does include how often is the map updated, and do we use census data? So yeah, hopefully that was answered. The census or American Community ACS data is in that census tab, so that is there. But as I say, there's two data sets really inside there. There's the ELA data and the census data, and they're meant to be sort of compared and looked at together. How often is the map updated? We're a very small organization. We did this whole thing on a shoestring, so I don't want to sort of over promise. I mean, it sort of depends on when there is new information, when there is time. There's no resources for this work, basically. But we have been updating now, less than before, but usually every month or two, there has been some kind of update, but not a full kind of revision or anything. And how was the data collected? Yeah, hopefully I've addressed that a little bit. I can talk more about that, but basically through these thousands of conversations, a review of all the literature. A lot of this is in that, I can put the link to that article that in Language Documentation and Conservation, or also a lot of detail in my book, Language City. How has Ella helped raise awareness? Yeah, raising awareness is a big part of what we do, and it's public events, it's classes, it's to some degree social media, it's writing articles, it's media. So we try to do a lot of things that really face the public, and the map itself, the print map, has been a very popular thing, which has raised a little bit of money for this work. So a lot of people have donated and received the print map. And in terms of preservation, that's some of that is more about documentation. And the question about literary languages, yes, so liturgical and literary languages are listed to some degree, and they are broken out. Latin, Old Church Slavonic, and so on are also there. There is a way to filter sort of current spoken languages versus liturgical languages. I didn't get into that. But we did think that that is an important thing to show as well. So if I'd had more time to get into it, we do have some of those kind of nuances and breakdowns. Sorry if I'm going a little bit quickly. I want to sort of get to everything, and then we can also return to things, and Shobha can moderate or however best. The last question: is there a deliberate effort on the part of immigration services or housing that keeps the ethnic language intact, enclave intact? It's an interesting question. I think that mostly it has to do with communities themselves, to what extent they try to sort of stay together, to what extent they can stay together, given all the challenges of doing that. So Seke speakers, to give the example of the language from Nepal that I mentioned, have managed to find apartments all near each other in just a couple of what I've called vertical villages, a couple of buildings in Brooklyn. And that's just through sort of the tight-knitness of the community, WhatsApp and WeChat groups where people are sort of sharing, oh, this apartment opened up. I don't think, they're all rental apartments. The landlords don't have any idea, who is there. Immigration services, I think they generally don't, and there's no sort of official entities that really from the city that even sort of know what's going on for the most part. But different communities have different ways of trying to very different extents of trying to kind of keep, areas for their language. I think the word enclave is interesting. I wasn't able to get into this, but actually sort of pure ethnic enclaves where everybody speaks a particular language or is from a particular group actually are very rare. And so for the most case, yes, even there are these so the vertical villages that I mentioned, but actually those buildings also have speakers of many other languages in them as well. So actually, there is, I think there are many more in the area of Queens where I live, as another example, no group has more than 10% of the population, basically. And any given block, it's really, dozens of languages being spoken. So yes, there are these sort of concentrations. And there are certainly differences based on social class, based on, group. It varies by group. Some groups really don't cluster in this way. But it certainly changes over time. This is all very dynamic. Obviously, I didn't even get into the questions of how do you map language when people are moving so frequently, when language itself is kind of such a mobile and fluid phenomenon. But we're trying to provide a sort of snapshot of Babel to give this visibility.